Revelation 3153. From the 8th to the 10th of June 1944. Effectiveness of grace through free will. Only the effect of human will is determined by God, but never human will itself. And therefore a person's earthly path is indeed predetermined according to divine plan, yet whether he travels it in accordance with divine will depends on his free will. The greatest gift of grace can be offered to him, it will only take effect in him if the will accepts it, if the human being opens himself to the strength which flows from this gift of grace. But if he uses this strength, it is his free will, and then one can never speak of a change of nature against his free will, of a change of nature which was achieved suddenly and only through God's grace. Because such a change would completely contradict God's plan of salvation, because then the supply of divine grace would have brought about this redemption and the human being himself would not have needed to be active in it. But divine love wants to produce perfect beings, and this perfection requires free will, thus the measure of grace he receives must always be adapted to this free will, that is, it must not force him to accept it, which, however, would inevitably be the case if the gift of grace overwhelmed him and suddenly resulted in his change. God's grace can certainly bring about a change in the human being, however, the human being must already have been inwardly willing to let the grace take effect on him, thus not to resist it. God's love provides every human being with a measure of grace which guarantees his complete transformation, his alignment with God, for the latter is the goal of all beingness in its last embodiment. And God will never withhold anything from a being which could bring it close to this goal. Rather, he applies an abundance of grace to the human being which, however, the human being's will can also reject and which then is also no longer effective. If, however, he is receptive to it, then he will be able to mature in a time which seems exceptionally short. He will, as it were, suddenly change. It will come upon him like a flash of realization because he willingly opens himself. Thus God's grace can obviously be effective in him. For grace is strength from God, it is helping assistance, it is, as it were, the transmission of godlike will, which includes all strength in itself as soon as the human being's will does not offer any resistance. Hence this person is chosen because he felt his calling within himself and complied with it. But it is never an inevitable transformation of his will, even though God's grace contributes much to the person giving up his resistance, for every person needs divine help, even if his will is turned towards God. But a person who is turned away from God can stand in the midst of grace. He repels it and consequently does not feel its effect either. And then he is completely unable to change according to God's will. His will is still so resistant that he does not subordinate himself to divine will and therefore cannot receive God's grace either, even though it is available to him without measure. He makes himself, as it were, unresponsive to it, which, however, does not exclude God offering it to him in all abundance. His love for his living creations will never diminish and he will not let any of them get lost, thus he will not give less consideration to any of his living creations but give them all the same opportunity to ascend, which therefore also means the same measure of grace which they may use for their higher development. But if the creature itself withdraws from the effectiveness of grace through its will, it has nevertheless not been given a lesser opportunity, just as, conversely, no exceptionally high measure of grace would be supplied to a human being if the will, the opening up of this grace, were not recognizable. And this will is seen by God, who knows about every smallest stirring of the heart, even though this is not yet evident to fellow human beings. The gift of God's grace therefore does not oblige, neither to work for him nor to shape oneself, it only gives the human being increased ability to change, but always under the condition that this lies in the human being's will to change in right knowledge of the truth. A person who is completely turned away from God will never have this will, and therefore he carelessly passes by the gift of grace which, however, is available to him, as it is to every other person. Thus the human being's will determines the measure of grace, not that which is given to him but that becomes effective in him. Through his willingness he can increase the influx of grace the more he uses it, and he will also do so because he thereby also comes to realize, to deeply believe in God's love, wisdom and omnipotence, and is now inwardly driven to strive towards him, to conform to him and to be active for him. Then God's grace has brought this about, but without his will it could never have worked. Amen.